Hello from the underground. Continuing with Goriot's Old Goriot by Balzac. Toward the end of the third year, old Goriot reduced his expenses still further, moving to the third floor where he paid 45 francs a month. He did without tobacco, dismissed his hairdresser, and used no more powder on his hair. When Goriot appeared for the first time without powder, his hostess let an exclamation of astonishment escape her when she saw the dingy, greenish-gray color of his hair. His face, with some hidden sorrow, had gradually made sadder day by day, seemed the most woe-begone of all those around the table. There could no longer be any doubt about it then. Old Goriot was an old rake, and only a doctor's skill had saved his sight from destruction by the drugs whose use was made necessary by his disease. The disgusting color of his hair was due to his excesses, and to drugs he had taken in order to be able to continue them. The poor old man's physical and mental state gave some grounds for supposing that these absurd stories might be true. When his stock of clothes was worn out, he bought calico at 15 sous per ell to replace his fine linen. His diamonds, gold snuff-box and chain, and personal ornaments disappeared one by one. He had left off his bright blue coat and his whole prosperous-looking outfit, and summer and winter wore an overcoat of gray chestnut-colored cloth, a mohair waistcoat, and thick, gray, closely woven woolen breeches. He grew thinner and thinner. His calves were shrunken. His face, once round and beaming with the contentment of a prosperous tradesman, became unusually lined. His forehead grew wrinkled, his jaw prominent. In the fourth year of his life at the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève, he was no longer the same man. The good vermicelli maker who used to look only 40 instead of 62, the stout, comfortable tradesman whose face was almost comical in its unsophisticated freshness, whose sprightly bearing had amused and diverted strangers who chanced to meet him on the street, whose smile was still young, now seemed at least 70, and stupid, dull and uncertain. His blue eyes, formerly so lively, seemed to have turned a sad leaden gray. They had faded and dried up, and their red rims seemed to ooze blood. People either pitied him or were shocked by him. Young medical students, noticing the drooping of his lower lip and the conformation of his facial angle, when they had teased him for some time without drawing any response, declared him to be declining into cretinism. One day, after dinner, when Madame Beaucaire said to him, banteringly, implying doubt of his paternal relationship, "Well, so those daughters of yours don't come to see you any more now?" Goriot winced as if she had pricked him with a sword point. "They come sometimes," he replied in a shaking voice. Oh, do they still see them sometimes?" cried the students. "Bravo, Papa Goriot!" But the old man did not hear the witticisms at the expense that his reply provoked. He had fallen back into a dreamy state that superficial observers took for a senile stupor, due to his lack of intelligence. If they had only known, they would perhaps have been keenly interested in the problem his physical and moral situation presented, but this was extremely obscure. Although it would have been easy enough to find out if Goriot had really manufactured vermicelli and what the exact figure of his fortune was, the old people who were inquisitive about him never left the district and lived in the boarding house like oysters on a rock. As for the others, when they turned the corner of the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève, they were caught up in a peculiar vortex of Parisian life, and did not spare a thought for the poor old man who was their butt. To the narrow-minded older people, as to the heedless young, old Goriot's dumb misery and his stupid apathy were incompatible with the possessions of wealth or of any kind of intellectual capacity. As for the women that he called his daughters, everyone shared the views of Madame Beaucaire, who said with that strict logic which elderly women who spend all their evenings gossiping acquire through their habit of always finding an answer to fit every question. If old Goriot had daughters as rich as all the ladies who came to see him appeared to be, he would not be in my house, on the 3rd floor, paying 45 francs a month, and he would not be going about dressed like a beggar. These conclusions could not be gainsaid. And so, toward the end of November 1819, at the time when the curtain rose on this drama, everyone in the boarding house had a very clear idea about the old man. He had never had either a daughter or a wife. A life of excess had made a slug of him, an anthropomorphous mollusk to be classified among the clothicifers, so said an official of the museum, one of Madame Vacquer's daily guests with a pretty wit of his own. Poiriot was an eagle, a gentleman compared to Goriot. Poré could talk and use his reason and answer when spoken to. As a matter of fact, he never contributed anything to the subject under discussion when he talked or used his reason or replied, for it was his habit to repeat what the others said in other words. But he joined in the conversation. He was alive. He appeared responsive to his surroundings, while Goriot, so said this official, was constantly at 0 degree Réaumur. Eugène de Rastignac had returned to Paris at this time, in a frame of mind common enough in young men conscious of abilities above the average, or stimulated by difficult circumstances to outstrip their fellows for a time. So, little work is required of law students for their preliminary examinations that in the first year in Paris, Eugène had been free to see the sights and taste the pleasures of the city. A student, indeed, has little time to spare if he wants to become acquainted with the entire repertoire of every theatre, map the winding of the Parisian labyrinth, become a citizen of the capital with a knowledge of its usage, its languages, and its peculiar pleasures, and explore its every nook and corner of good or bad repute, while following the course of lectures that please him in taking stock of the treasures piled up in museums. At this stage in his career, a student is on fire with enthusiasm for moonshine, which appears magnificent to him. He has his hero, his great man, a professor at the Collège de France, paid to adapt himself to the mental level of his audience. He adjusts his cravat and poses for the benefit of the women in the first galleries at the Opéra Comique. Passing through one initiation after another, he gradually loses his greenness, life's horizons expand before his eyes, and, in the end, he achieves some perception of how human beings are packed in strata, layer above layer, in the framework of society. If he has begun by admiring the carriages parading the Champs-Élysées on a sunny afternoon, he soon starts to covet them. Eugène had reached this stage in the unconscious apprenticeship he was serving. When he left Paris for the long vacation after taking his degree as Bachelor of Arts and Bachelor of Law, his childish illusions, his provincial ideas had gone. His increased knowledge, his kindled ambition, had opened his eyes so that once he was back in the manor house of the family circle, he saw things clearly as they were. His father, mother, 2 sisters and 2 brothers, and an aunt whose whole fortune consisted of annuities, all lived on the little estate of Rastignac. The income, about 3,000 francs, from this property varied according to the varying prices offered for the vine crop, yet every year 1,200 francs had to be drawn from it for him. Eugène noted the constant worry about money, which his family had generously concealed from him. He could not help comparing his sisters, who had seemed so lovely to him in his childhood, with the women of Paris. who had realized the beauty he had dreamed of. He was conscious that the uncertain future of his large family depended upon him. He watched the parsimony with which every crumb was hoarded, and saw the family drink wine made from the lees of the wine press. In sum, a multitude of circumstances it was necessary to detail here made him long to distinguish himself, and his ambition to succeed increased tenfold. Like all great minds, Eugene wished to owe his success to nothing but his own merit. But his temperament was preeminently southern, so that when he came to carry them out, his resolutions were bound to be affected by the hesitations that seize young people when they find themselves on an open sea, anxious to exert their strength, but not knowing in which direction to steer, nor how to trim their sails to catch the wind. If at first he wanted to throw himself heart and soul into work, he was soon diverted from this purpose by the necessity of acquiring social connections. Then he realized how much influence women have in social life, and suddenly made up his mind to strike out into the world to win patronesses for himself. How could they fail an eager and idealistic young man whose ardor and wit were set off by an elegant appearance and a kind of vigorous beauty by which women are so readily attracted? These ideals assailed him in the fields, during the walks which he had formerly taken so gaily with his sisters, who now found him greatly changed. His aunt, Madame de Marsillac, had been presented at court and had there become acquainted with the highest in the land. Suddenly the ambitious young man recognized that the reminiscence with which his aunt had so often lulled him to sleep in nursery days and elements of several social successes, at least as important as the success that was his goal at the school of law. He questioned her about relatives whose acquaintances might be claimed again. When she had shaken the branches of the genealogical tree, and the old lady judged that of all the persons who might be of use to her nephew among the selfish tribe of rich relations, Madame la Vicomtesse de 𝐵𝐿𝐶 would be most amenable. She wrote a letter in the old style to this young woman and entrusted it to Eugene, telling him that if he had a success with the Vicomtesse, she would introduce him to other relatives. A few days after his return to Paris, Regnistan sent his aunt's letter to Madame de 𝐵𝐿𝐶. The Vicomtesse replied with an invitation to a ball on the following evening. Such was the general situation in the boarding house at the end of November 1819. Some days later, Eugene, having gone to Madame de 𝐵𝐿𝐶's ball, came in about 2 a.m. As he danced, this stout-hearted student had promised himself to make up for the time he had lost by working until daylight. He was going to remain awake all night for the first time in that silent quarter, for the sight of the splendors of society had magically given him a burst of artificial energy. He had not dined at the boarding house. The lodgers would probably think that he would walk back from the ball at daybreak, as he had sometimes done after a fête at the Prado, or a ball at the Odéon, getting his silk stockings muddy on the way and ruining his pumps. Before bolting the door, Christophe had opened it to look out into the street. Regnistan happened to arrive at this moment, and was able to go up to his room without making any noise, followed by Christophe, who was making a great deal. Eugene undressed, put on his slippers and an old coat, lit his turf fire, and prepared himself for work so rapidly that the clatter of Christophe's big boots drowned out the very slight noise of his preparations. Eugene sat absorbed in thought for several minutes before plunging into his law books. He had just become aware that Madame la Vicomtesse de 𝐵𝐿𝐶 was one of the queens of fashionable Paris, and that her house was known as the pleasantest in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. She was, moreover, by reason of her name and her fortune, one of the outstanding persons of the aristocratic world. Thanks to his aunt de Marseilhac, the poor student had been kindly received in this house before he had realized what a favor this was. To be admitted to these gilded salons was equivalent to being awarded a patent of nobility. By his appearance in this most exclusive of circles, he had gained the right of admission everywhere. Eugene had been dazzled by the brilliant assembly, and had scarcely exchanged a few words with the Vicomtesse. He had contented himself with singling out from among the crowd of Parisian goddesses with which this rout was packed, one of those women at whose feet a young man must fall from the very first. The Countess Anastasie de Ristol was reputed to have the prettiest figure in Paris. She was tall and gracefully made. Imagine great dark eyes, a beautiful hand, a finely modeled foot, and movements full of fire and spirit. A woman that the Marquis de Ronquerolles called a thoroughbred. Her highly strung temperament had no complementary defect. She was well developed and rounded, without anyone being able to accuse her of being too plump. Thoroughbred. Woman of breeding. These locutions were beginning to take the place of the heavenly angels, the oceanic figures of speech, and all the old erotic mythology which dandies no longer affect. But for Rastignac, Madame Anastasie de Ristol was a woman longed for. He had contrived to write his name twice in the list of partners on her fan, and managed to snatch a few words with her during the first quadrille. "Where can I see you again, madame?" he said abruptly, with a passionate insistence that women find so flattering. "Oh, anywhere," she answered. At the Bourbons, in my own house." The adventurous southerner had done all he could to put himself on a footing of intimacy with this enchanting countess, so far as a young man can cultivate a woman's acquaintance during a square dance and a waltz. When he told her that he was a cousin of Madame de Beauseant's, this great lady, as he took her to be, was prepared to receive him, and he was invited to her house. And the parting smile she threw him made him think that to call on her was a social duty. He had had a good fortune to light upon a man who did not laugh at his ignorance, an unpardonable crime to the gilded young coxcombs of the day, men like Malincourt, Ronquerolles, Maxime de Trelles, de Marseille, Ajuda Pinto, Vendenis, who were there in all the glory and pride of their dandyism, mingling with the most elegant ladies of fashion, Lady Brandon, the Duchess de Langeais, the Comtesse de 𝐎𝐥𝐝, Madame de Sietzi, the Duchess de Carigliano, and Comtesse Firaud, Madame de Lanty, the Marquis d'Anglemont, Madame Firmiani, the Marquis de Listomere, and the Marquis d'Espard, the Duchess de Maufrigneuse, and the Grade Leos. It was lucky for him, then, that the green student happened upon the Marquis de Montevideo, the Duchess de Langeais' lover, a general as simple as a child, for whom he learned that the Comtesse de Ristol lived in the Rue des Elders. What joy it was to be young, athirst for the world and on fire for a woman, and to see two great houses open their doors to him. To plant a foot in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, in the house of the Vicomtesse de Beauseant, and to fall on his knees before the Comtesse de Ristol in the Chaussée d'Antin. To see before him a vista of all the salons of Paris, and to believe himself a fine enough fellow to find aid and protection there in a woman's heart, to feel himself ambitious enough to spurn the tight rope along which he must walk with the self-assurance of the acrobat who cannot fail, and to have found in a charming woman the best of balancing bowls. With such thoughts in his head, and a vision of this woman rising magnificently beside a fire of peat, between the law on one side and poverty on the other, who would not, like Eugène, have thrown an eager glance into the future and decked it with success? His wandering fancy was anticipating his future joys so fast that he was dreaming himself by Madame de Restaud's side, when a sigh like a grunt of an overtasked Saint Joseph disturbed the silence in the night, and echoed in the young man's heart with an anguish which made him take it for a groan of a dying man. He opened his door softly, and in the passage saw a line of light under old Goriot's door. Eugène was afraid his neighbor must be ill. He put his eye to the keyhole, looked into the room, and saw that old man engaged in work of so criminal a nature that it was obvious his duty to society to investigate what the so-called vermicelli manufacturer was up to in the night. Old Goriot had attached a silver gilt saucer and vessel like a soup tureen to the crossbar of a table turned upside down before him, and was twisting a thick rope round the richly chased metal with such terrific force that he was bending it, apparently into the shape of ingots. Heavens, what a man! Said Rastignac to himself, watching the old man's muscular arm. With the help of the rope, he noiselessly threaded the silver as though it had been dough. Was he a thief, or a receiver, then, who was feigning helplessness and stupidity, and living like a beggar in order to carry on his traffic more securely? The student raised his head for a moment as he asked himself this, and then applied his eye to the keyhole again. Old Goriot had unwound the rope and spread his counterpane on the table. Now he took the flattened mass of silver and rolled it on the table to shape it into a bar, an operation which he performed with astonishing ease. He must be strong as Augustus, King of Poland, Eugène said to himself when the bar was almost finished. Old Goriot looked at his handiwork sadly, with tears running down his cheeks. He blew out the wax paper which had lighted him to his task, and Eugène heard him groan as he got into bed. "He's mad," thought the student. "Poor child," said old Goriot aloud. When he heard this, Rastignac judged it prudent to keep his indecent dark, and not condemn his neighbor too hastily. He was about to return to his own room when he suddenly heard an indescribable sort of noise, as if men in list slippers were coming upstairs. Eugène strained his ears, and did in fact make out the sound of two men breathing. He had not heard the doors squeak or any footsteps, yet all at once he saw a dim light glimmer on the second floor, in Monsieur Vautrin's room. "Queer goings-on for a family boarding-house," he said to himself. He went down several steps and listened intently, and caught the clank of money. Soon the light was extinguished, breathing was audible once more, without the door having been heard to open. Then the sound died away as the two men went downstairs. "Who's there?" cried Madame Vauquer, opening her bedroom window. "It's me coming in, Maman Vauquer," said Vautrin in his deep voice. "That's odd. Christophe bolted the door," said Eugène to himself as he went back to his room. "In Paris, you need to keep your eyes open at night to know what's going on around you." Distracted from his ambitious lover's dreams by these events, he set himself to work, but his thoughts strayed to suspicion about old Goriot, and still more persistently to Madame de Restaud's face, which kept arising before him as a herald of a brilliant destiny. In the end, he went to bed and slept with clenched fists. Out of 10 nights dedicated to work by young men, 7 are spent in sleep. One has to be older than 20 to stay awake all night. Next morning, Paris was wrapped in one of the dense fogs that envelop it sometimes and make it so dark that the most precise and punctual people are led astray. Business appointments are missed. Everyone thinks it's about 8 o'clock when midday is striking. It was 9:30, and Madame 𝐎𝐥𝐝 had not yet stirred from her bed. Christophe and fat Sylvie, also later than usual, were tranquilly taking their coffee. Made with the top layer skimmed from the milk meant for the lodgers, whose share Sylvie was boiling well so that Madame 𝐎𝐥𝐝 should not notice that this illegal tithe had been abstracted. "Sylvie," said Christophe, dipping his first piece of toast into his coffee, "Monsieur Vautrin had 2 people here to see him last night again. If Madame asks about it, mind you say nothing to her. He really isn't a bad sort, you know." "Did he give you anything?" "He gave me 100 sous for the month, one way of saying, keep your mouth shut." "Him and Madame Couture are the only ones who don't look twice at every penny. The others would all like to take away with one hand what they give us with the other on New Year's Day," said Sylvie. "And what do they give us?" said Christophe. "A beggarly 100 sous. Old Goriot had cleaned his shoes himself for the last 2 years. Poirot's a miserly curmudgeon who does without cleaning altogether, and he would rather drink the blackened than put it on his down-at-heel old shoes. As for that whippersnapper of a student, he gives me 40 sous. 40 sous doesn't pay for my brushes, and he sells his old clothes into the bargain. What a hole this place is." "Nonsense," said Sylvie, sipping her coffee. "We're not so badly off. We have the best place around here that I know of. But what about that big fellow Vautrin, Christophe? Does anyone say anything about him?" "Yea. I met a gentleman in the street a few days ago who asked me about him. He said, 'Haven't you got a tall gentleman who dyes his whiskers staying in your place?' I said, 'No, sir, he doesn't dye them. A grey spark like him hasn't the time.' And when I told Monsieur Vautrin about it, he said, 'You were quite right, my lad. That's a fine way to answer them. There's nothing more annoying than letting other people know your weak points. It can spoil your chances of a good match.' They tried to pump me too in the market. They wanted to know if I ever saw him with his shirt on." "What tomfoolery!" "Goodness," she interrupted herself. "That's 10:15 striking at Wall de Grace, and nobody's stirring. What does it matter? They've all gone out. Madame Couture and her young lady went to Mass at Saint Etienne at 8 o'clock. Old Goriot started off somewhere with a parcel. The student won't be back until his lecture's over at 10 o'clock. I saw them all go when I was doing my stairs, and old Goriot gave me a slap with what he was carrying, something hard like iron. What do you make of the old codger? The others can't let him alone. They treat him like they were his plaything, but he's a decent soul, all the same, and worth more than all the lot of them put together. He doesn't give much himself, but the ladies he sends me sometimes are dressed very fine and hand out grand tips." "The ones he calls his daughters, do you mean? There's a dozen of them." I've only been sent to 2. The same one who came around here." "There is Madame moving. She's going to kick up a fine shindy. I'd better go. You watch the milk, Christophe, and mind the cat." Sylvie went upstairs to her mistress. "How's this, Sylvie? 10:15. You've let me sleep on like a dormouse. I've never heard of such a thing." "It's because of the fog. It's that thick you could cut it with a knife." "But what about breakfast?" "Pah! The devil is in your lodgers today. They all cleared out as cockerel crow." "Speak properly, Sylvie," said Madame 𝐎𝐥𝐝. "You should say cock crow." "I'll say whatever you like, madame, but the fact remains that you can have your breakfast at 10 o'clock. The Michonnet and Poiru Père haven't budged. They are the only ones in the house, and they're sleeping like logs." "But, Sylvie, you talk of them as a pair, as if—" "As if what?" asked Sylvie, bursting out into a loud, silly laugh. "They're a well-matched couple." "It's queer, Sylvie. How did Monsieur Vautrin get in last night after Christophe had bolted the door? Not in the least queer. He heard Monsieur Vautrin and went down to open the door for him. And here was you thinking, give me my bodice and run and look after the breakfast. Dish up what's left of the mutton with potatoes, and you can put the stewed pears on the table. Those that cost a farthing each. A few minutes later, Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴 came downstairs, just in time to see what the cat had tipped over the plate covering a bowl of milk and was lapping away at full speed. "Mr. Gris!" she cried. The cat fled, and then came back to rub itself against her legs. "It's all very well to look as if butter wouldn't melt in your mouth, you old humbug. Sylvie." "Sylvie? What's the matter now, madame? Just look what the cat's done." "It's that stupid Christophe's fault. I told him to lay the table. Where had he gone to—" "Don't worry, madame. We'll make old Goriot's coffee out of this. I'll put water in it. He'll never notice. He never notices nothing. Not even when he's eating." "Where has the old heathen gone to, I wonder?" said Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴 as she set the plates around the table. "Who knows? He's up to all sorts of devilment." "I have overslept myself," said Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴. "But Madame looks as fresh as a rose." At this moment they heard the bell ring, and Vautrin came into the room, singing in his loud voice, "I've roamed around the world for years round, no matter what my like might be." "Ah, hello, ma 𝐎𝐿𝐴. Good morning," he called out at the sight of his hostess, putting his arms gallantly around her. Now, that's enough. You naughty man. Go on, say it. Wasn't that what you were going to say? Hold on a minute. I'll help you lay the table. Oh, what a nice man I am. Don't you think so? With a dark blonde I've always found in love. I've just seen something very funny. They're all alike to me." "What?" asked the widow. "Old Goriot, in the Rue Dauphine at 8:30 this morning, at a jeweler's where they buy old plates and gold lace. He sold them a piece of silver plate, a nice piece of work for someone not in the trade, and not got a good sum of money for it." "Not really?" "Yes, indeed. I was coming back here after seeing off one of my friends who was going abroad by Royal Mail steamer. I waited for old Goriot to see what would happen. It's a good joke. He came back to his part of the world, to the Rue des Gris, the house of a well-known moneylender called �絵𝐥𝐿𝐴, a bad egg, capable of making dominoes out of his father's bones. A Jew, an Arab, a Turk, a scallywag, whatever you like to call him. It would be a hard job not to rob him. He puts his pennies in the bank." "What in the world can old Goriot be doing?" "Doing nothing," said Vautrin, "contriving his own undoing. He's a madman, fool enough to ruin himself for the sake of girls who—" "Here he is," said Sylvie. "Christophe," called old Goriot, "come upstairs with me." Christophe followed old Goriot, and then reappeared almost immediately. "Where are you going?" Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴 asked her servant. "On an errand for Monsieur Goriot." "What have you got there?" said Vautrin, pouncing on a letter in Christophe's hand and reading aloud, "Madame la Comtesse Anastasie de Restaud." "And where are you taking it?" he added as he gave back to the letter. "To the Rue de Helder. I have to give it to nobody but the Comtesse." "What's inside it?" said Vautrin, holding the letter up against the light. "A bank note." He peered into the envelope. "No, a receipted account. My word, he's a gallant man, the old dotard." "You get along now, you rascal," he said to Christophe, giving him a cuff on the head with a big hand that made him spin round. "You are sure to be given a fine tip." By this time the table was laid. Sylvie was boiling the milk. Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴 lit the stove with some aid from Vautrin, who was still humming to himself, "I've roamed the world for years round, no matter what my luck might be." When everything was ready, Madame Mademoiselle Taillefer came in. "Where have you been this morning, my dear lady?" asked Madame 𝐎𝐿𝐴, turning to Madame Couture. "We have been saying our prayers at Saint Etienne de Mont, for you know it's today we are to go to Monsieur Taillefer." Poor little thing, she's trembling like a leaf. said Madame 𝐎𝐥𝐝, sitting down in front of the stove and holding out her steaming shoes to it. Warm yourself, Victorine, said Madame 𝐎𝐴. It's all very well to pray to God to soften your father's heart, said Vautrin, pushing forward a chair for the girl. But that's not enough. You need a friend who will make it his business to tell the blackguards some home truths. He has 3 millions, so they say, and he's a barbarian if he grudges you a dowry. A pretty girl needs a dowry in these hard times. Poor child, said Madame 𝐎𝐴. Never mind, my pet. If your father behaves in this monstrous fashion, his wickedness will only bring misfortune down upon his head. When she heard these words, Victorine's eyes filled with tears, and at a sign from Madame 𝐎𝐥𝐝, the widow held her tongue. If we could only see him, if I could speak to him myself and give him my wife's last letter, said the Commissionary General's widow. I have never dared take the risk of sending it by post. He knows my handwriting. Oh, innocent, unhappy, and persecuted women, exclaimed Vautrin, interrupting her. Have things come to this pass? In a few days' time I will look after your affairs myself, and then all will be well. Oh, sir, said Victorine, with those ardent look from her eyes still full of tears at Vautrin, who did not appear to be in the least touched by it. If you know any way of approaching my father, please tell him that his affection and my mother's honor are more precious to me than all the money in the world. If you could induce him to relent towards me, I would remember you in my prayers. You may be sure of my gratitude. I've roamed the world for years round, sang Vautrin sarcastically. At this moment, Goriot, Mademoiselle Marqueneux, and Poirot all came downstairs together. Perhaps the smell of the sauce which Sylvie was making to serve with what was left of the mutton had drawn them to the dining room. As the 6 guests and their hostess said good morning to each other and sat down to table, 10 o'clock struck, and the student's step was heard outside. Well, Monsieur Eugene, said Sylvie, you were going to have the company of all the others at breakfast today. The student greeted the other lodgers and sat down beside old Goriot. I've just had an odd adventure, he said, helping himself generously to mutton and cutting a slice of bread which Madame 𝐎𝐴 kept her eyes fixed on as she silently estimated its size. An adventure, said Poirot. Well, do you? Well, what do you find surprising about that, old cock? Vautrin asked Poirot. This gentleman is just the sort to have them. Mademoiselle Taillefer glanced shyly at the young student. Tell us your adventure, ordered Madame 𝐎𝐴. Yesterday, I was at the ball at the house of a cousin of mine, the Vicomtesse van Beauchamp. She has a magnificent house. The rooms are all hung with silk, and she entertained us sumptuously. I was as happy as a king. Fisher, said Vautrin, interrupting him abruptly. What do you mean, sir? Said Eugene sharply. I say Fisher because kingfishers enjoy much more happiness than kings do. That's true. I would rather be a carefree little bird like that than a king because, began Poirot, always eager to echo another's thoughts. Anyhow, the student went on, cutting him short, I danced with one of the loveliest women at the ball, an enchanted countess, the most delightful creature I have ever seen. She had peach blossoms in her hair, and a beautiful cluster of flowers, real sweetly scented flowers, on her dress, but, oh, you should have seen her. It's impossible to describe a woman glowing with the joy of dancing. Well, this morning, I met the diving countess about 9 o'clock, on foot, in the Rue des Grès. My heart started thumping. I guessed that she was coming there, said Vautrin, throwing a searching look at the student. She was probably going to visit old 𝐎𝐥𝐝, the moneylender. If ever you explore the hearts of Parisian women, you will find the moneylender there rather than the lover. Your comtesse is called Anastasie de Registaux, and she lives at the Rue des Helder. At the sound of the name, the student stared at Vautrin. Old Goriot abruptly raised his head and gazed at the two speakers with a look so full of intelligence and anxiety that the lodgers were astonished. Then Christophe will be too late. She must have gone there, he exclaimed in an agonized voice. I guessed right, said Vautrin, leaning over to whisper in Madame Vauquer's ear. Goriot went on eating mechanically without knowing what he ate. He had never seemed more stupid or more lost in his own thoughts than he did at that moment. "What the devil can have told you her name, Monsieur Vautrin?" demanded Eugene. "Aha, I have you there," replied Vautrin. "Old Goriot knew all about it, so why shouldn't I know, too?" "Monsieur Goriot!" exclaimed the student. "What is it?" said the poor old man. She was very lovely yesterday evening, wasn't she?" "Who?" "Madame de Restaud." "Look at the old wretch," said Madame Vauquer to Vautrin. "Just see how his eyes are shining." "Then he does really keep her," said Mademoiselle Marquenot in a low voice to the student. "Oh, yes, she was lovely beyond words," Eugene went on, while old Goriot watched him avidly. "If Madame de Beauseant had not been there, she would have been the queen of the ball. The men had eyes for nobody else. My name was the 12th on her list, and she danced every quadrille. The other women were furious. If anyone was happy yesterday, it was certainly she. There never was a truer saying that the most beautiful things in the world are a frigate in full sail, a galloping horse, and a woman dancing." "Yesterday dancing at the Duchess' ball," said Vautrin. "This morning visiting a moneylender. From the highest arc of fortune's wheel to the bottom of the social ladder. Behold the progress of Parisian women. If their husbands can't support their unbridled extravagance, they sell themselves. And if they can't do that, they are ready to tear the living vitals from their mother to get the cash to make them shine. There's nothing they won't do. I know they're kind. And well." Old Goriot's face, which had shone like the sun on a fine day as he listened to the student, clouded over at this cruel speech of Vautrin's. "Well," said Madame Vauquer, "what was the adventure? Did you speak to her? Did you ask her if she would like to learn law?" "She didn't see me," said Eugene. "But it was not strange to meet one of the prettiest women in Paris in the Rue de Gris at 9 o'clock. When she could not have come from the ball before 2 in the morning. It's only in Paris you meet with such adventures." "Ha! You may meet with such funnier things than that," exclaimed Vautrin. Mademoiselle Taillefer had hardly listened to all of this. She was so much preoccupied with the attempts that she was about to make. Madame Couture now signed to her that this was time to go undress. When the two ladies went out, old Goriot followed them. "Well, did you see that?" said Madame Vauquer to Vautrin and her other lodgers. "It's clear as day that he had ruined himself for the sake of those women." "Never will you make me believe that the beautiful Comtesse de Restaud belongs to old Goriot," cried the student. "But we don't care very much whether you believe it or not," Vautrin interrupted him. "You are too young yet to know Paris. Later on you will find out that there are what we will call men with a passion here." At these words, Mademoiselle Marquenot looked at Vautrin with an awakened air, as if she were pricking up her ears like a trooper's horse at the sound of a trumpet. "Ha!" said Vautrin, interrupting himself to throw a searching look at her. "Have we had our little passions too?" The old maid lowered her eyes like a nun beholding a statue. "Well," he went on, "these people get their teeth into one idea, and you can't shake them loose from it. They are thirsty, but only for water, taken from one particular well, and often stale. To get a drink of it, they would sell their wives and their children. They would sell their very souls to the devil. For some men, this well is gambling, speculation on the stock exchange. Or it may be music, or a collection of pictures, or insects. For others, it is a woman who knows how to cater to their tastes. If you offered all the women in the world to these last, they would not care a straw. They would only want the one who gratifies their passions. Often this woman does not love them at all and treats them like dogs. Their scraps of satisfaction cost them very dear. But no matter, these old fish never tire from it, and they would pawn their last blanket to raise their last 5 francs apiece for her. Old Goriot is one of these men. The Comtesse exploits him because he is discreet, and that's the way of the fashionable world. The poor beggar hasn't a thought in his head that isn't devoted to her. Apart from his passion, as you see, he is a brute beast. But just start him on that topic, and his face sparkles like a diamond. It's not hard to guess that secret. This morning he took silver to the melting pot, and I saw him visit Papa 𝐎𝐥𝐵 in the Rue des Grès. Note that, fellows. On his return, he sends his noodle Christophe to the Comtesse d'Aristot. Christophe showed us the address of the letter there, and there was a receipted bill inside. It's clear as daylight that if the Comtesse was also going to the old money-lender, the affair was urgent. Old Goriot has gallantly paid her debt for her. You don't even need to put 2 and 2 together for that to be plain as a pikestaff. That proves to you, my young student, that while the Comtesse was laughing and dancing and showing off her tricks, waving her peach blossom crown about with her dress gathered into her hand, she was on pins and needles, as they say, thinking of her dishonored bills or her lovers. You make me mad to know the truth, exclaimed Eugene. I shall go to Madame d'Aristot's tomorrow. Oh, yes, said Perrier. You must visit Madame d'Aristot tomorrow. Perhaps you will find Goriot there, come to receive the reward for his gallant services. But, said Eugene with disgust, your Perry is nothing but a slough. And a very queer slough, too, replied Vitrine. If you get splashed with its mud riding in a carriage, you're an honest fellow, while you're a rogue if you get touched on foot. If you have the bad luck to nab something from somebody, you become a peep show for the crowd of the Place de Palais de Justice, but you are pointed out in the salons as virtue itself if you steal $1 million. And what's more, you pay 30 millions to the police force, and the law courts maintain this system of morality. It's a pretty state of affairs. What was that you said? Exclaimed Madame Vauquer. Has old Goriot taken his silver breakfast service to be melted down? Were there 2 doves on the lid? Asked Eugene. That's the very bowl. He must have thought a great deal of it. He wept when he had broken up the bowl and saucer. I happened to see him, said Eugene. It was as dear to him as life, replied the widow. You see how infatuated the old chap is, exclaimed Vitrine. This woman must know how to tickle his soul. The student went up to his room. Vitrine went out. A few minutes later, Madame Couture and Victorine got into a cab which Sylvie had gone to fetch. Poirier offered his arm to Mademoiselle Mocheneux, and they set off together to enjoy the 2 fine hours of the day strolling in the Jardin des Plantes. There you see, they are practically a married couple, said fat Sylvie. It's the first time they've gone out together. They are both so hard and dry that if they knock against each other, they'll strike a spark like flint and steel. Look out for the Mademoiselle Mocheneux's shawl, said Madame Vauquer, laughing. It'll go up in a blaze like tinder. When Goriot came in at 4 o'clock, he saw by the light of 2 smoky lamps that Victorine's eyes were red. Madame Vauquer was listening to the tale of the fruitless visit paid that morning to Monsieur Taillefer. Taillefer was annoyed with his daughter and the old woman because of their attempts to see him, and had granted them an interview only in order to make his views clear. Fancy, my dear lady, Madame Couture was saying to Madame Vauquer. He did not even make Victorine sit down. And she had to stand the whole time. To me, he said, he wasn't at all angry, only very cold. That we were to spare ourselves the trouble of coming to see him. That the young lady, he did not call her his daughter, lowered herself in his opinion by pestering him once a year, the monster. That the Victorine's mother had no fortune when he married her. Victorine could have no claim to anything. Altogether, he said such cruel things that made the poor little thing cry. Then she threw himself at his father's feet and very bravely said to him that it was only for her mother's sake, and that she had gone on trying to see him, and she would obey her wishes without a murmur, but she implored him to read the poor dead woman's last sworn words. She took the letter and offered it to him with the most beautiful words in the world, and expressing the finest feelings too. I don't know where she got them from. God must have given them to her, for the poor child was so plainly inspired that as I listened to her I couldn't help crying like a fool. And do you know what the abominable man was doing while she was speaking? Cutting his nails. He took the letter that poor Madame Taillefer drowned in her tears and threw it to the mantelpiece and said, "Well, that's all right." He was going to help his daughter to her feet, and she took his hand and would have kissed them, but he pulled them away. Isn't that scandalous? And this great booby of a son came in and took no notice of her. They must be monsters, said old Goriot. Then, went on the Madame Couture, without paying any attention to the old fellow's exclamations, the father and son went out, and they bowed to me first and begged me to excuse them. They had urgent business to attend to, and that was our visit. At least he had seen his daughter. I don't know how he can disown her. They're as like as 2 drops of water. Now the residents had daily boarders dropped in one after another, exchanging greetings and the meaningless remarks that pass for wit among certain class in Parisians. Silliness is their basic ingredient, and their whole point consists in the way they are said or the gestures that accompany them. This kind of slang is always changing. The catchword on which it is founded never lives longer than a month. A political event, a case being heard at the law courts, a song on the streets, or an actor's gag, anything and everything may provide material for this kind of drollery, whose principle consists in treating ideas and words as shuttlecocks, to be bandied from one person to another as with battledores. The recent invention of the diorama, which had carried optical illusion one stage further than the panorama, had led in some studies to the pleasantry of talking rama. And a young painter who frequented the Maison Vauquer had inoculated the boarders there with a disease. "Well, monsieur, pour ya," said the museum official, bowing his. How is your little health-orama?" Then, without waiting for a reply, "Ladies, is there something wrong?" he said to Madame Couture and Victorine. "Are we going to have dinner?" shouted Horace Bianchon, a medical student and friend of Renaissance. "My little tum-tum is sinking usque de teleones." "It's desperately chilly-orama," said Vitrine. "Move over there, Pogoyot. The devil take it, your foot is blocking up the whole front of the stove." "Illustrious Monsieur Vautrin," said Bianchon, "why do you say chilly-orama? That's wrong. It should be chilly-rama." "No," said the museum official. "It's chilly-orama, by the same rule that you say, my feet are chillier than yours." Oh. "Here's your Excellency, the Marquis de Regniston, Doctor of Law and Locks," cried Bianchon, seizing Eugene by the neck and nearly throttling him. "Hi, you others, come in." Mademoiselle Moqueno entered quietly, nodded to the boisterous companions without saying anything, and walked over to take her place near the 3 women. "That old bat always makes me shiver," said Bianchon in a low voice to Vautrin, with a gesture in Madame Moqueno's direction. "A man studying Gall's phrenological system, as I am, sees that she has the bumps of Judas." "Oh, monsieur has met her, has he?" said Vautrin. "Who hasn't come across her?" resumed Bianchon. "Upon my word, that ghastly blanched old maid reminds me of those long worms you find in beams that go on gnawing until the whole beam is eaten away. There you have it, young man," said the man of 40, running his fingers through his whiskers. A rose, and she has lived a rose's span, 3 morning hours." "Ah ha ha! Here comes a fine superama," cried Poyot. as Christophe came in respectively, bearing the soup. "Excuse me," Madame Vauquer corrected him. "It's cabbage soup." And all the young men burst into guffaws. "You're dished, Poirier." "Poirier is dished." "Score 2 points to Madame Vauquer," said Vitrine. "Did anyone notice the fog this morning?" asked the official. "It was a frantic fog," said Biancon. "An unparalleled fog. A mournful, melancholy, pea-green, breath-catching fog. A Gourier of a fog." "A Gourier-orama," said the painter, "because you could not make out anything in it." "Hey, Lord Gaioriete?" Sorry. "They be talking about Yahoo." Gourier was seated at the lower end of the table, near the door through which Christophe was bringing in the food, and with his head thrown back, he was sniffing at a piece of bread which had been placed under his napkin. This was an old business habit, of which he was sometimes reverted. "Well," screamed Madame Vauquer sharply in a voice that rose above the chatter of spoons and plates and the din of people talking, "is the bread not good?" "On the contrary, madame, it is made from Etampes flour, best quality." "How can you tell that?" said Eugene. "By its whiteness, its flavor." "You mean its smell, since you are smelling it?" said Madame Vauquer. "You're so thrifty nowadays that you won't be long finding a way of keeping alive on the nourishing smell from the kitchen." "Take out a patent for the process, then," cried the museum officials. "You'll make a fortune." "Never mind him. He does that to persuade us that he has been a vermicelli maker," said the artist. Then is your nose a corn taster?" inquired the official. "Corn what?" asked Biancon. "Corn-el, corn-et, cornelian, corn-ice, corn-eucopia, corn-crack, corn-cockle, corn-orama." These 8 answers shot from all sides of the room like a rain of bullets, and the laughter they excited among the merry companions was all the more uproarious because old Goriot was looking at them with a bewildered air, like a man trying to understand a foreign language. "Corn," he said to Vitrine, who sat near him. "Corn on your toes, old boy," said Vitrine, giving him a tap on the head that drove his hat down over his eyes. The poor old man was dumbfounded at this sudden attack and made no movement for a moment. Christophe took his plate away, thinking he had finished his soup, so that when Goriot pulled up his hat and started to use his spoon, he knocked it on the table. All the boarders burst out laughing. "You're a mischievous clown, sir," said the old man, "and if you take a liberty like that with me again—" "Well, what then, pa?" Vitrine interrupted him. "Well, you'll pay dearly for it some day." "In hell, you mean?" said the painter, "in a little black corner where they put bad boys?" "Well, mademoiselle," Vitrine said to Victorine, "are you eating nothing? Your father was stiff-necked, was he?" "He was horrible," said Madame Couture. "We'll have to bring him to his senses," said Vitrine. Mademoiselle Victorine could bring an action for ailment since she can't eat, said Risnera, who was sitting near Biancon. "But just look how old Goriot was staring at her." The old man was forgetting to eat as he watched the poor girl, whose face bore the marks of unmistakable grief, the grief of a child disowned by a father she loves. "You've made a mistake about old Goriot, my boy," said Eugene in a low voice. "He's neither an imbecile nor an unfeeling block. Apply your Gaull's system to him, and tell me what you make of him. Last night I saw him crush a silver dish as if it had been wax, and the expression on his face just showed extraordinary emotion. His life seems to me to be too mysterious not to be worth the trouble of looking into. No, Biancon, you needn't laugh. I'm not joking." "The man is a pathological case, observed Biancon. "I agree with you there. If he wants me to, I will dissect him." "No, feel his bumps." "Oh, all right. Perhaps his idiocy is catching." Next day, Eugene dressed himself in style. and set out about 3 o'clock in the afternoon to call on Madame de Restaud, busily building on the way those madly extravagant castles in the air which give young people's lives such a rich emotional coloring. When engaged on this exercise, they can think of nothing of obstacles or danger. Success crowns everything they undertake. The mere play on the imagination gilds the existence with romance, and the figures of enterprise that never had a life outside their fevered fancy can reduce them to a sadness or discouragement. If they were not inexperienced and shy, the social world would be impossible. Eugene walked with 1,000 precautions against splashing himself with mud, but with his mind wholly fixed on what he should say to Madame de Restaud. He laid in a stock of wit. He invented scintillating retorts to imaginary remarks. He prepared his polished lines, his phrases in the style of Talleyrand, for imaginary situations favorable to the declaration on which he was to find his fortune. And so he became splattered with mud after all, poor student, and was forced to have his shoes polished and the breeches brushed at the Palais Royal. If I were rich, he said to himself as he changed a 5-franc piece that he had brought in case of need, I should have gone by cab. Then I could have thought at my leisure. At last he reached the Rue des Halles and asked to see the Comtesse de Restaud, with the old cage of a man sure of triumphing some day. He faced the scornful glance of the lackeys, who had seen him crossing the court on foot and had not heard the sound of a carriage driving up. He was all the more sensitive to their stare, because he had already felt the pang of inferiority when he entered the court and saw the splendid horse in rich harness pawing at the ground, and one of those smart cabs which flaunt the luxury of a spendthrift existence, and implying the possession of all that is undesirable in Parisian life. The student all at once felt out of humor with himself. The open drawers of his brain, which he was relying on finding full of wit, closed up. His mind became a blank. The footman went to announce the visitor's name to the Comtesse, and while he waited for her answer, Eugene stood on one foot before the window of an anteroom, leaning an elbow against the window latch and looking vacantly into the court. He found the minutes pass slowly, and he would have gone away if he had not been endowed with that southern tenacity of purpose which works miracles when it sees its path straight before it. Brilliant. All right, loves. We'll cap it there for now. Cannot wait to resume this with you. Vaya con Dios from the underground. Mushy mushy. Das Boot.